On February 10th of this year, it was a Saturday, I went on a goose hunt with my two brothers in Oklahoma, 5 hours north of here, backwoods Oklahoma. I'm goose hunting. By the way, do we have any bird hunters in the audience? Anybody? A few of you? Okay. Well, when you hunt geese, you lay on your back. And so the three of us, as well as about a dozen other guys, are lying flat on our backs with about 1,500 goose decoys surrounding us while we wait for the favorite command from our field guide: shoot. And so we're lying there and we're waiting. About 2 hours into this hunt, the hunt's going pretty well, and I'm lying on my back, and I see a creature flying overhead, which I think in my head, that looks very ungoosey. It was a duck. Ducks are not in season. And I watch this duck flying overhead, and I'm just like, we'll see what the guide says. And I hear off in the distance this sort of garbled sound. It's sort of like, shoot, shoot. I cast off all restraint, any thought about what species this creature might be, and I start blasting away as the duck flies peacefully off into the distance. So I lay back down, and I'm ready for the next shot, but I hear off in the distance, the field guide is continuing to shout, and he's getting closer, and I realize he's shouting at me with all kinds of obscenities and profanity. He literally is cussing me out in front of my brothers and my friends, and I'm like, what is going on? I realize that he was not saying shoot, but don't shoot, which, by the way, they're pretty different commands. So I realized he was actually saying don't shoot, and so being cussed out, I don't take very kindly to. I'll be honest. I responded with a little bit, I'm a pastor. I would never, be out of line. A little bit of attitude. And I tell him if he just said nothing, I wouldn't have shot. He says, I don't need anybody popping off at me. Get off the field and go home. Literally says that. So I pop off a little bit more. Engage in calm discussion, trying to restore the sinner into the family. No. And so I respond, we dialogue a little bit, so fine, I'm muttering to myself, I'm packing my bags up, and I get to I've packed the very last thing, and I'm literally going to walk off the field while everybody else is still on the field, and the guy calls me over. He says, hey man, I'm sorry, I lost my cool, but if you had shot that duck, and if I got caught, it would have been $1,000 of fine, I would have lost my license, and so I just freaked out, I'm really sorry, you can go hunt. And so I went back and hunted, and I sit down, I see my younger brother right next to me is actually laughing because he shot at the same time as me and didn't confess. But I lie back down and continue the hunt. Now, bird hunting is one of my favorite activities in the world. I love it, but one thing I learned that day is that if you are terrified that a single failure will get you kicked off the field, even your favorite activity is not very fun. And a lot of us live our lives that way. We live as though, with God, almost like we're already off the field. Like some of us, we have a failure in mind. Maybe it was something that was too big or too frequent or too recent. Maybe it was that addiction that we said, I'm going to stop this, I'm going to stop this, I'm going to stop this, and we fell back into it, and we feel like we just can't get out of the hole, and we feel like we're sort of off the field, so to speak, with God. Others of us feel like we are on the field, but if you were to really look into our hearts, the reason we feel like we're on the field with God is not so much because of the unconditional love and grace of God, but really, we've just got a pretty good streak going. We go to church every Sunday, and we're an upstanding good citizen. We vote, and we, try to help grandma cross the street. And so we're just feeling pretty good about ourselves because we haven't done all the big bad stuff very recently. But what happens when you do? Because one thing I've learned is that failure isn't just a part of my past life, it's a part of my present life. And if my way of dealing with the shame of failure is through success, then I'm sure to be disappointed. And by the way, this is not just in the religious world. This is in the non-religious world too. So much of the world is trying to prove I'm a good enough mom, I'm a good enough dad, I'm a good enough business person, I'm a good enough pastor, I'm a good enough fill in the blank. I want you to accept me. I want to be able to stay on the field. But it's really the same thing. We have a fear of failure that leads to rejection. And the way that we're dealing with the shame of failure is through the hope of success. And it actually doesn't work. I'm going to talk about a better way this morning of dealing with the shame of failure. We're in a series called Shame Off You. Shame Off You. And we've been dealing with shame. This is the third week of the series. Next week, we're going to talk about living from our true identity. Okay, so shame tears us down shame tears us down. Grace builds us up by telling us a story of who we really are. We'll talk about how we live from that true identity. And the week after that, this will be the first week in May, Caleb Sutherland, who's also in the back with all those disciple makers, is going to talk about how do we take these lessons where we've talked about overcoming shame and set other people free from shame. Because anything that God does in your life is never just for you. It's always also for other people. And so Caleb's going to talk about how we can set others free from shame. So now that you have a little bit of a preview, we're going to be in the story of the prodigal son today. It's in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. I'm going to pick it up in verse 17, but let me just give you a little bit of the story. This is the third consecutive parable that Jesus is telling, and they all have to do with someone finding lost people. Okay, and this one, it's a lost son. And so the story goes like this. You have three characters. You have a father who's very wealthy, and you have two sons. The younger son says to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance," which is the equivalent of saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead so that I could just have your money now." There's not a relationship there. The son has already turned his heart from his father. But the father doesn't judge his motives. He gives him the inheritance, and the young son goes off and says he moves to a foreign country, and he squanders it all on wild living, and the predictable happens. He's the coolest guy in town for 15 minutes of fame, but then he loses it all. And then a recession hits, and it gets worse, and he starts to come to his senses. And what we're going to read is the story of how he comes to his senses through pain. And then we're going to read the response of the two other characters in the parable. First, the response of the prodigal's father. Is he going to show contempt toward his son for squandering his life savings? How's the father going to respond? And then we're going to see the response of the older brother. So let's pick it up in verse 17. It says, "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field." So we're going to see the response now of the older brother. "The older son was in the field, and he came and drew near to the house. He heard music and dancing." And watch how he won't even talk to his father. He calls a servant. "He called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. Father leaves the party. 'Come on, son.' He answered his father, 'Look, these many years I've served you.' Some versions there say, 'I've slaved away for you.' and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed a fattened calf for him?" He said to him, "Son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." Here's the first point that I want to make today. First point I want to make today. We need more than a theology of grace. We need the story of grace to become our story. Let me say it again. We need more than a theology of grace. We need the story of grace to become our story. This parable is aimed at the Pharisees, the religious leaders who were judging Jesus for spending so much time with these sinner types, with these prodigals. Jesus is explaining why he's doing this. The elder brother is the Pharisees, these religious leaders in the parable. And these religious leaders, if you read the gospel accounts, what's fascinating about the Pharisees is that you rarely see Jesus criticizing their theology. Sadducees, that was another group of religious leaders, he would criticize their theology a lot more. Very rarely would he criticize their theology. Usually he would actually affirm their theological system. If you asked a Pharisee what grace was, they would have been able to tell you. They would have been able to define it. Oh, grace. Grace, yeah, we have the Day of Atonement. Every year, of course, we need our sins forgiven. Oh, David says in Psalm 32, "Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven." Yes, grace. I believe in grace, God's unmerited favor, God's unconditional love. And yet the Pharisees, represented by the elder brother, they had a theology of grace, but they never allowed grace to become their story, the story of grace to become their story. And I wonder how many of us in this room are like that. I wonder how many of us are saying, "Oh yes, I know how to define grace. It's unmerited favor. It's unconditional love. It's God's love and forgiveness and all. This is not attached to my behavior." Oh, for sure. We could define it. We could defend it. We could dissect it. We could share it with the masses. But have we received the story of grace? The story that we're living in has more power over us than the theology that we hold. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. Theology is hugely important. It is massively important. But if I have a theology of grace like the Pharisees, but I'm not living in the story of grace, if instead I'm living in a story of shame, then my definitions of grace will not set me free from shame. The fact that you have right definitions of grace will not set you free from shame. We have to move from the shame story to the grace story. And all of us are living in one story or the other. All of us are living in a shame story or a grace story. Did you know that your brain is wired for story? The neuroscientists throughout the 20th century, this was a part of their fascination, was to answer the question, how can the brain process such a massive amount of input? Think about the millions of things that you've probably already processed this morning. How does the brain make sense of all of this? You know what neuroscientists have concluded? That it all goes into a story that your mind is telling yourself. Okay, so here's kind of a little example to help explain that. So a few weeks ago, I'm coming home from work. Alicia's in the kitchen, and I'm coming home, and I'm thinking in my head, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm coming home a little later than usual. And I walk in the door, and Alicia says, "Oh, you're here later than usual." Now, did I interpret this as just a random piece of input? No, I didn't. There was a broader story by which I interpreted this data point, okay? And that story goes back a decade and a half to the beginning of our marriage, where I legitimately allowed workaholism to eat away at our marital bliss. And we had to argue over that and fight through that and seek help through that. It was a very hard season, but a season where that memory was vivid because it was painful. And so when I heard Alicia's comment, I didn't hear it as a random comment. The way I interpret it was, you're a bad husband. You're a workaholic. And if you don't change, I can't accept you just like you are right now. Now, you want to know how I know it's not like I was consciously thinking these thoughts. I don't want to paint it like that. I wasn't, but the story was so entrenched in my mind that I went all elder brother on her. I lashed out, and it became about a 2-hour argument that had us staying up later that night to try to reconcile this thing. Do you see how we are all telling ourselves a story? And it can be in adulthood, like that story, what I just told. It can be something that goes back to childhood. It can be a mother who berates her son consistently every time he misbehaves. She's ingraining in him a story that says if you behave well, you'll be accepted. Or a father who doesn't affirm his daughter. Or in the teenage years these days with social media, a teenager who gets ostracized. Or for the seniors in the audience, have you ever had an adult daughter or an adult son tell you that the problems in their life are because you didn't raise them well enough? All of these experiences become part of a vivid shame story that we tell ourselves, and if we're not careful, we become enslaved to. Now back to our parable. The prodigal son and the elder brother are both living inside of the same shame story. Both of them are enslaved by the fear of rejection that comes with feeling like you're not good enough. Now, it's easier to see in the case of the prodigal. It's harder to see in the case of the elder brother. Prodigal first. The prodigal, you remember his canned speech? You know, this is not the way you really relate to people. You don't rehearse a speech that you're going to go and present to them, but that's the way the prodigal was. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Therefore, make me like one of your hired men. In other words, my behavior has disqualified me. I have not been good enough to count myself worthy. That's how we know we're dealing with a shame issue. Shame deals with issues of worth. I don't have the inherent worth to be acceptable just like I am. But the prodigal has completely given up of meeting his perceived standard. So instead of asking to come back into the family, he's just, make me a slave. I'll just be a slave. And that's what he wallows in his sin and his shame, just make me a slave. So you can see the shame there. But now let's look at the older brother. The younger brother says, I'm too unworthy to be accepted. The older brother says, I'm worthy to be accepted. Why? Because I've slaved away in your fields. Can you imagine that? This older brother looks back on all of his history with his father and says it was slavery. Do you see how for both the younger brother and the older brother, it's a different form of slavery? The younger brother has given up on being accepted and settled for a life of slavery. The older brother has given his all to being accepted. So he's volunteered to slave away in order to earn a spot at dad's dinner table. Both of them are motivated by the same fear of failure. Both of them have equated my acceptance with my behavior. Both of them are living inside of a shame story. Do you see it? So which story are you living inside of? Are you living in a shame story or a grace story? Because we need more than the theology of grace. We need the story of grace to become our story. Have you gotten there? Or do you have the theology of grace, but you're still actually living in shame? Proving yourself like the older brother or settling like the younger brother. You want to know how you know which position you're in, if you're in the shame story or the grace story? Your pastor came up with a grace test. Okay, So I'm going to give you guys a question. I want you to ask yourself and legitimately consider which of these categories you fall into. Am I a comparing critic, a wallowing prodigal, or a celebrating son? Am I a comparing critic, a wallowing prodigal? I got the word reverse. Are you a wallowing prodigal, a comparing critic, or a celebrating son? Which of those three would you say more typically defines you? The wallowing prodigal, why does the wallowing prodigal wallow in his sinfulness and in his shame? He thinks he has to pay the price for his own sins and failures. He's shaming himself as a way of alleviating and healing his own shame. But it doesn't work. The comparing critic, why does he compare? He compares to make up for the inadequacies that he feels in himself. At least I'm better than that guy, therefore I belong. Instead of shaming himself to heal his shame, he shames others to heal his shame. The celebrating son realizes that shame never heals shame. I can't heal my shame by shaming myself. It might numb it for a minute and medicate it, the fact that I'm paying the price by wallowing in it, but it really doesn't do anything good for us. I can feel better about myself for a moment by saying I'm at least better than Zach. But then Zach's going to show me up in something. It doesn't work. Or am I a celebrating son? Am I a celebrating son? This is how we know that grace has truly become our story. When the story of grace becomes your story, your life becomes a grace party. Your life becomes like legitimately a celebration. And don't take this the wrong way. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm not saying there will never be suffering, there never will be sadness. There absolutely will. In fact, they might even be prominent parts of our lives. They were Jesus. He was a man of sorrows, but he was also partying all the time. What this means when I say our life will become a grace party is that there's always enough grace to endure through sorrow and suffering, and there's always enough grace to be grateful in every situation. Our life should be marked by grace and celebration. If we've truly received it unto ourselves. The elder brother, he can't celebrate anyone except himself and his own performance. Anytime somebody else is elevated, he takes it as a personal offense. Wallowing prodigals can't celebrate either because they're wallowing. Which one are you? Would you like to become the celebrating son or daughter for that matter? What does it take to become that? What does it take to become that? This is our second point for the morning. To live inside of a grace story, we must allow the story of grace to interrupt the story shame is telling us. We must allow the story of grace to interrupt the story shame is telling us. This is exactly what happens in the parable. Do you remember the canned speech? There were 3 sentences. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm unworthy to be called your son. Therefore, make me like one of your hired men. He goes to repeat his rehearsed speech to Dad, but Dad only lets him get 2 sentences in. He won't even let him volunteer for slavery. Dad says, no. We're not doing that. He says to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. He interrupts the story this wallowing prodigal's shame has been telling him about his own failure. He interrupts it altogether and says, no, we're not going there. It's grace for you. Now, he attempts this with the elder brother. It says he leaves the party. He goes out and entreats him, but the elder brother resists the grace. He won't let grace interrupt the story that shame has been telling him, which is, I'm worthy because I've been slaving away. I've proved that I belong here. You have to let grace interrupt the story shame is telling you. I want to give you 2 practical ways that you do that. 2 practical ways to let grace, the story of grace, interrupt the story that shame is telling you. And the first one is this: journey with friends who are living the story of grace. Journey with friends who are living the story of grace. I want to put a hypothetical out there for a moment. I want you to imagine that the prodigal son, in coming home, what if instead of meeting his father first, what if the prodigal son, in returning home, if the first person he came in contact with was the elder brother? What do you think would have happened to the prodigal then? Who do you think you are, wasting dad's money? I've been over here slaving away, and you've been spinning in all this mess. Get out of here and go where you belong. He would have been turned away. I bet you dad would have never even been told he came home. If we're living a shame story and we surround ourselves with other people who are living a shame story, we'll never get out of it. We'll actually entrust, we'll maybe take a moment and be vulnerable with somebody, and they'll shame us with the advice. Oh, the reason this is happening in your life is because you need to do that. Like,